As I was listening to the scripture passage, one important theological question kept ringing in the back of my mind. And that was, Melissa, do you still have any extra Frosty gift cards? Oh, awesome. I'll see you after church. Okay, great. Well, last week we began exploring the 4 spiritual types. And we started by briefly looking at each one of the types, and then I sent you all home with a quiz. Now, if you missed last week or you didn't get a quiz, there are some extras. There are the red sheets of paper at the back of the room on the bell choir tables. And so I just invite you to take one of those home this week so that you can keep up with us these next few weeks. But before we begin, I want to take a poll for those of you who did take the quiz. How many of you here, your type came out as being a theologian, or you were stronger on the theologian side? Okay? I'll be honest, this is my strongest one too, so we probably think alike if you were a theologian. How many of you were mystics? Okay? I got like a 7 for theologian and 5 for mystic, so I'm right up there. Awesome. Okay. That's a pretty big group for a church. Mystics are usually one of the smaller groups. How many of you were crusaders? Ooh, wow. Okay. That's not surprising because crusaders also, small group. Hard group to be in too. But an important group. And last but not least, who are my caregivers here in this congregation? All right. Well, that's the group that we're going to explore today a little bit more in depth. And caregivers, when Jesus gave the most important commandment to love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, caregivers are the ones who can love God most readily with their hearts. They're passionate about people and they experience faith by having interactions with other people. And for caregivers, this part of the worship service, this is actually the hardest part, the sermon. And it's because there's no opportunity for interaction. You just have to sit and listen to me lecture. What could sound more boring and horrible than that? And so caregivers aren't passionate about the sermon, but they love getting together for hymns of praise and singing together. And caregivers also might like Bible studies. But not because of the study itself, although they might like that. But what they really love about Bible study is getting together and being able to talk and converse together as a group. Caregivers can see God shining through in each of us. That's how they experience God, is through people. In this story today, we see an extraordinary caregiver. Jesus is making his big trip to Jerusalem. And as he's traveling, he comes to a small village. So he does what's customary in these times. He finds some people that he knows in the village. And when he gets into town, he comes and stays at their house. He stays with whichever resident he knows. And in this case, it's Mary and Martha. So they offer him their home. They lodge him. And in exchange, it's expected that Jesus will spend the evening teaching the people of the village. And so that's just what Jesus does. So Martha, she gets right to work. She starts cleaning house. She starts preparing the meal and just getting everything in order, knowing that she will be feeding Jesus, his 12 disciples, and probably a good number of the people who live in the village who turn up to hear Jesus teach. So she's busy cooking and preparing, and when she peers out of the kitchen to see what's going on, well, what does she see? She sees Mary, and she's not helping with the work. Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet, listening to what Jesus has to say. Now, in our day and time, we may not be able to fully appreciate just how odd this situation is. But if you look at this story from a first century perspective, it's really something very remarkable that's going on. And to understand that, first we need to understand what Mary is doing. She's not just shirking work or hanging out with Jesus. Mary is, in this time and place, if a person was sitting at the feet of a rabbi, the feet of the rabbi was the place where a disciple would sit. It was a sign that he was that rabbi's disciple. And I do mean that it was a sign that he was that rabbi's disciple, because women would never be permitted to be disciples in the first century perspective. Disciples were sorts of apprentices for wise rabbis, and they would be expected to turn around, follow the rabbi, and carry that rabbi's message as they became rabbis themselves. To be a disciple meant you were a follower. You were learning from the rabbi so that you could in turn become his follower and carry on his work. And so first, we need to understand that what Mary is doing is something that's really revolutionary. Just by sitting and listening to Jesus talk, she's making a statement that anyone can be a disciple, not just men. Well, if Mary is making this profound and brave statement by sitting at Jesus' feet, well, what is Martha doing? Well, she's doing what a customary first century woman would be doing. She's managing the household while all the men folk listen to the rabbi teaching, or at least the men folk and Mary. So Martha isn't just angry that Mary is sitting around not helping. She's mad because she thinks Mary is upending the status quo. She's doing something that Martha doesn't think that she can do. So Martha has a few words with Jesus, which makes sense because in her mind, if you have a headstrong woman doing something that's challenging the status quo, well, what you do is you go to the authority figure. You go to the rabbi and you ask him to set her straight. According to the Voice translation, Martha interrupts Jesus. Lord, why don't you care that my sister is leaving me to do all the work by myself? Tell her to get over here and help me. Well, Jesus responds, Martha, Martha. Says her name twice. There's an emphasis there. You are so anxious and concerned about a million details, but really, only one thing matters. Mary has chosen that one thing, and I won't take it away from her. Well, what's the one thing? What is Mary actually doing? It's not just that she's not doing the work. It's that she's taking on the role of a disciple, even though she's a woman. Mary doesn't care about what the rules are. Most caregivers don't. She just wants to be close to Jesus. She wants to know who He is. And I think that is really because Mary is a caregiver. And so people are more important to her than processes or rules. It's not that she doesn't care about the task that she's supposed to be doing. It's that a relationship is more important to her. You see, disciples make it their business to be close to the rabbi so that they can in turn bring the good news out to others and to bring others close to the rabbi, in this case close to Jesus. And the job description hasn't changed much in 2,000 years. Maggie Gobran grew up in Cairo, Egypt. She was part of the upper class there. And she was part of an affluent Coptic Christian community. Coptic Christians have lived in Egypt for thousands of years. Her parents were academics. And so back in the 80s, when she finished her studies, she followed the family tradition and did what was expected of her. And she became a professor at American University in Cairo. Well, one Christmas, she and some church friends went to a neighborhood in Cairo called the Zabaleen. And I call this a neighborhood, but really what it is it's the city dump for the entire city of Cairo. It's the landfill. And keep in mind, Cairo is no small town. It's a city that's about 3 times the size of Chicago. And so it's a really big landfill. It's huge. This community of people live in this landfill. They survive by raising pigs who feed off of what's in the landfill. These are some of the poorest people in all of the world. So Maggie and her friends are handing out Christmas packages to these poor people living in squalor. But at one of the garbage mounds, she saw something moving. And she began to dig. And as she dug, she found a small child who was living buried in the garbage. A little bit later, she found another one. Now, a few days later, she went back to her teaching job. And as she taught, she realized that her heart just wasn't in it anymore. She couldn't stop thinking about those little children living in the garbage. It didn't matter what was expected of her, that she continue this life of a wealthy academic. She was a caregiver. And so she knew that she had to be around those people in the Zabaleen landfill. She knew that they had changed her life. And so she left. Since 1985, she's been living there with them, caring for them. She's opened a school which serves hundreds of children, and her organization, which is called Stephen's Children, serves the community and helps people to know that God loves them. There's an orphanage now that takes care of hundreds of children so that no one will ever find a child there again buried in garbage. Her first generation of children, who grew up in the late 80s, now have grown up, and many of them have become teachers in the school, equipping the children to live a good life. I got to hear her speak at the Willow Creek Global Leadership Summit last year, and they honored her there. She shared in her words that we don't choose where to be born, but we do choose whether to be sinners or saints, to be nobody or to be heroes. She said, the poor are not just naked of clothing or of food or of shelter. They're naked of dignity. Caregivers are often compassionate about missions because they are the most sensitive to the pain of others. They love people, and they'll often do anything to bring dignity back to people. And Maggie, or Mama Maggie as she's called there, is a caregiver. Caregiver may be as great as Mary. Caregivers aren't as concerned about the rules. They don't care about doctrine or church processes. They're the ones who know how important people are to God. They're not content with busy work. They want to sit at the feet of Jesus, hear His message, and then be that message to others. And that's a good place to be. Because Jesus isn't as concerned about whether the busy work gets done, it seems, at least not in this story. He seems to be more concerned with our hearts. He doesn't seem to care whether we get the doctrine right, important as that might be. He doesn't seem to care if we administer things efficiently, even though that's important too. Jesus doesn't say, follow these steps and pray this prayer to be saved. He says, come and sit at my feet. He says, show me the love that exists in each one of you. Now, I will share with you that on my spiritual type survey, I scored a 0 in the caregiver column. It's consistently my lowest type whenever I've taken that quiz. It's not my strength. I'm a theologian. I have strengths as a mystic too. And it's easy for me to become a Martha. I very often miss the human needs that exist behind the churchy things that we do. And I'm so grateful for caregivers who often remind me of what's actually important in the kingdom of God. You know, a few years ago I was in seminary and there was this caregiver who was in a lot of my classes. I'm going to call him Kenneth today. I didn't like Kenneth. And let me tell you what Kenneth's problem was. He was always thinking with his heart. And so one summer, I was in this group that did service projects through Perkins, and Kenneth was in it too, and we spent this week in mission all around the city of Dallas, and one day we went to this homeless shelter. Kenneth and I, of course, as hard as I tried not to have this happen, we were put in the same group. The two of us ran this little clothes closet that people came into, and I knew that it was going to drive me crazy all day. And so people came in, and hundreds of people came in. And what they were allowed to do is pick things out, and then they gave us their information sheet. It had all of their information that had been processed through when they entered the homeless shelter. And then there was a checklist, and we had to make sure that they took the right number of things, and they didn't take too much of one thing so that everybody else could find something. And this really appealed to the Martha in me, because I could go through the checklists and make sure that everything was done efficiently and in the right way. And I was so proud. We're going to have hundreds of people pass through thanks to the efficient way that we would run this. And I knew Kenneth was going to mess that up. Sure enough, he did. Every time a person would come through, he would talk to him and make conversation with him. He'd look at the clothes that they picked out. If a woman picked out a blouse, he would compliment how it would look on her, that it would look really nice. Eventually, and by the way, the line is backing up as he does this, so I was getting a little bit angry. Now, eventually, this 19-year-old kid comes through the line. And aside from the fact that I had a hard time wrapping my mind around how a 19-year-old becomes homeless and lives on the streets in downtown Dallas, I processed his form, passed it on to Kenneth. Kenneth starts having this conversation with this kid. It lasts 10 or 15 minutes. Pretty soon, Kenneth steps away from the table where we're processing everything. And he sits down and talks even more with this kid. And then he gives him a hug before the kid leaves. Which really ticked me off because the line was really long by the end. So the day ends, and we head back. Kenneth was going to give me a ride back to Perkins. I'd come with someone else who'd had to come earlier in the day. And I noticed that Kenneth was driving a truck. And I happened to know that he owned a sedan. And so I asked him if he bought a new car. And he said, well, no, but I needed to borrow my son's truck because I had brought a bunch of stuff to donate. I couldn't fit it in the car. So I just brought his truck today. And I said, oh, I knew you had daughters. I didn't know you had a son. How old is he? He said, oh, he's 19. And that's that moment when I realized how precious Kenneth saw that person who passed through the line, because it could have been his son. Even though they're inefficient, even though they can leave us behind to our busyness, we need caregivers. Because people need to see the love that Jesus came to give. We can have great doctrines. We can go to great lengths to make sure that we believe in the right way. We can have big, impressive ministries and beautiful cathedrals. We can have spectacular worship services. But unless people can see that love rules everything in our hearts, then it doesn't matter. Thank God for caregivers who show the world that our God is, before anything else, a God of love. That's the kind of spirituality that breaks barriers for people and shows them who our rabbi really is. That's the kind of spirituality that brings people in from lonely places to sit at his feet. And everyone has a spot at his feet.